This is a very special panel for me. I've been traveling to the Middle East for many years now, and I'm amazed every time I make that trip and I see the compounded development and growth in the region. Today, that's even more apparent than ever before. We have this impending global crisis and the impact of the Ukraine war. But one thing that we see in the Middle East is that there is tremendous amount of opportunity and resilience as a stable player in the space. And the Middle East has a very young, dynamic population. There's lots of opportunities, and there's tremendous government support in innovation and programs. So I'm going to start off the conversation with Mohammed. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about Investopedia, and as the CEO of Investopedia, Investopia, what we have to look forward to in the future.
Thank you, Rabia. It's a pleasure to be here today at SALT, and let me just shed light on Investopia. Investopia is a global platform initiated by the UAE government. The word Investopia coming from utopia, the ideal city, and that's where we see an ideal platform for investors and businessmen, entrepreneurs, intellectuals to meet and discuss different aspects within the now economies. We initiated Investopia to serve investors, to be the place for them to discuss their concern, to explore the business opportunity, and to meet on a regular basis. Networking is essential in a post-COVID era, and that's what we got in mind within Investopia.
That's great, thank you. And Amer, you are the managing director and head of emerging markets fixed income at BlackRock. So you have a big job, and at one of the biggest asset management firms, you must see a lot on what growth and inflation trends are. What do you see today, given your seat, happening in the global economy? And then we can double click into the Middle Eastern economy as well.
With pleasure, absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. I happen to be by genetics a Middle Eastern myself, but my day job tends to be much more global. And so what I want to spend is maybe 2-3 minutes on the global context through which we're looking at the investment environment, right? There's bad news mainly, but then there's good news at the end. The bad news is that the global economy is going through a significant amount of structural shifts. After 30 years of extremely cheap funding, those days are over. Real interest rates after inflation have gone from roughly minus 100 basis points to plus 100. That's a huge shock that we had not seen. So cost of funding has become extremely expensive, right? Much significantly more expensive than before. You also have a world in which the availability of liquidity, the ampleness, the fluidity of liquidity that we've had for the past 20 years is clearly being curtailed. And you could see that. Right? The liquidity in the global economy is already, the reduction of the liquidity is already showing up in the real economy. And we can see it both on the investment side, but also on the real side. The result of both of these is that the global economy itself is decelerating, and decelerating quite sharply, right? This above-trend growth that we've seen since the 1990s, buttressed by things like globalization, by China, by the ample liquidity and the cheap funding is also gone and behind us. And finally, on top of it, we have a new geopolitical reality. The unipolar days of one large center of power is no longer with us anymore, and now we have multiple centers. And during that, as a result of that vacuum, you're creating all these geopolitical tensions of the kind that we just saw recently, Ukraine, also the China-US tensions, right? So that's the bad news. We have a paradigm shift. We have a structural shift that is not incredibly supportive for the investment backup. However, and this is where the silver lining is two things, right? The first of which is that the global economy is actually structurally in an okay shape. Usually when you get these kinds of paradigm shifts, these structural negative shifts, if you are over-leveraged, if your balance sheets are problematic, these shocks kill you. The good news today is that the global economy is actually in a good shape. Balance sheets are in a clean The companies and most sovereigns, not all, most sovereigns have used the period of ample liquidity and cheap liquidity and strong growth to strengthen and buttress their balance sheets. So the first point here is that the global economy is okay and can handle these shocks. The second, and this is really what surprises me, is that we've had these shocks for more than 2 years now, and we've actually been quite good at absorbing them, right? And we're quite ahead in terms of the adjustment. I hate using sports metaphors, but we are in the 8th inning of the adjustment, right? That had started around 2 years ago. So we're in a better shape to handle it, and we're already quite advanced. So we're at the point right now where we can start looking at the recovery. We can start looking at the end of the shock, at the bear market that we've seen recently. Let me stop there.
Well, just to kind of continue that, where do you see the Middle East in this global economy? And Sufyan, I'd love for you to also weigh in on that. There are quite a few countries who are struggling right now, but it seems like the Middle East is prime for opportunity. Would love you to weigh in on that.
Absolutely. So unfortunately, I'm Lebanese, so I'm gonna ignore the problematic names. I know you're Syrian as well, Noor. Unfortunately, the Middle East is two Middle Easts today. There's the problematic Middle East and the really interesting Middle East, sadly. So I'm going to ignore the first and focus on the second, right? And the reality is, the good stories in the EM, particularly in the Gulf, are actually, just on the face of it, are in a, and I'm going to use this word carefully, in a boring place, in the sense that everything's going well for them, right? Cyclically, it's difficult at this stage today. Cyclically, it's very difficult to be negative, right? The process of two things in particular, the reopening and how well it was managed, the COVID reopening and how well it was managed, both on the medical side, but also on the regulatory side, has been quite smooth and, more importantly, quite sustainable, and there's a huge upside just to get us back to where we were pre-COVID. More importantly, obviously, is where oil prices are. The amount of liquidity that's coming as a result from the level of oil prices plus the production that we're seeing with the marginal producer right now simply makes the problem so much easier, right? The rising tide is so powerful at this point that even if you ignore the two things that I'm going to be talking about next, we are in a great place, right? You're seeing it both in terms of economic recovery. Growth is well above trend. You're seeing it in the balance of payments, the funding needs, huge surpluses that are being created. Those surpluses are being used to delever, right? They're not borrowing. They don't need to borrow anymore. So debt is shrinking quite a bit. And again, as a result of the cyclical shock, positive cyclical shock, the fiscal accounts are very positive. So we're now jumping into surpluses across the good parts of the EM. Of the GCC. Now that's the boring part, the part that is very much a function of the cyclical positive shock associated with higher oil prices. The good news, though, is that there is something structural happening, right, that goes beyond the positive cyclical shock that comes from one price, right? And this is very different. I'm very old, as you can see from my white hair. This is very different than the previous periods of oil spikes. The region in general has been very good about using that surplus in order to deal with things structurally, right? And there's multiple things. Deleveraging is one thing that I just mentioned. Looking for new areas of growth and sectoral that can put us on a position to be able to sustain growth even when oil prices drop, very much why we're here, I suspect, to think about these kinds of new things. The fiscal shifts that are occurring, right? The introduction of very rational tax systems, the retrenchment on spending in real terms, so not using that surplus to increase consumption, but rather to increase investments as well. These are all things that makes me feel very comfortable that philosophically our capability of handling the eventual, let's be clear, at some point oil prices are very cyclical. At some point they're going to drop. And if they do drop, we're in a much, much better position today to handle it than we used to be before. Are there no risks? Of course not. There are significant risks, right? But whether they're still a debt overhang that has not disappeared. I mean, all the debt that we created during a period of low oil prices, we're delevering, but it's still quite high. There is issue of fiscal centralization and fiscal regimes that deals with weak countries. How do you deal with Oman? How do you deal with Bahrain? How do you deal with the weaker Emirates in the UAE itself, right? So that process of fiscal intermediation is something that is needed. The demographic issue, although I have to say the Golden Visa program is incredibly positive in that sense, but it's still an issue, the demographic issue as well. And finally, we still have an issue of regulatory improvements that are needed to create productivity and efficiency. So long story short, a very strong cyclical backdrop that really puts us in a very strong position in the short term. Structurally, we're handling things, and I think next time there's lower oil prices, we're going to be in a much better place than we were before, and there are still risks, and hopefully we'll be dealing with them. Let me stop there.
Thank you. And Sufyan, are you seeing that as well? You sit as the regional head of operations, MENA at the IFC. It's obviously apparent what's happening globally. Can you zone in on what you've been seeing and some of your observations on inflation and growth?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And I agree with Amer in most of his assessment and analysis. And of course, this is a region that facing a lot of challenges, starting from conflict to the impact of food crisis to the tension that we see around the world. But also, I think, present a lot of opportunities, and many countries are changing the rule of the game when it comes, to their approach to development as well as, investment. I think a demonstration of that, what we see around the climate business in the region, and this is a priority for international investors, for IFIs, including, of course, IFC as part of our commitment to that. Many countries are adopting, policies and regulations to be more conducive for engaging in this business. I think the UAE is an example where they adopted the net zero emission initiative, by 2050. There is also commitment around COP27 in Egypt, and also a golden opportunity where we have COP28 hosted by the UAE. It is estimated that a climate business, based on our estimation of only 3 economies in the region, Jordan, Egypt, and Morocco, that there is a potential investment of around $265 billion only in these three countries. And then I would say the second important area of interest and focus by international investors and IFIs is around disruptive technology, the focus on SMEs. This is a region that even before COVID needed to create around 300 million jobs. If we look at the macro context and the economic situation of all countries, this will not come from public sector, neither from business as usual. It needs to focus on the disruptive technology supporting entrepreneurship. It is estimated that there is a funding gap of around $200 billion in MENA region, focusing on SMEs. And the third important area, I would say, is around food security. Many countries are adopting, including the UAE, GCC, are adopting a very dynamic and engaging, I would say, strategy around food security, including investing in the region, but even beyond. And finally, I would say what we call it the cross-border investment. And here, we as IFC, we use our office in Dubai as a hub to work with all major regional and global UAE-based companies to support their expansion, to emerging market.
That's great. And just to expand on one of those points that you brought up, where there is a huge focus on disruptive technologies. Noor, you're the founder of Global Ventures, one of the region's premier venture funds. Can you talk a little bit about some of those disruptive technologies that you're seeing? We talked a little bit earlier in the introduction about the dynamic young population in the region. Would love to see some of the founders you're seeing, would love to hear about some of the founders you're seeing in the region and how you've been investing in them, and then also how global investors are looking at them.
Thank you. Thanks, Rabia. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. So yes, as the founder of a VC firm, we tend to see a lot of companies at this point, across the Middle East and Africa, which is our investment market. We receive about 600 or 700 companies a month for us to review and to look at. So there is a huge opportunity there to really accelerate some of these companies. Part of that is simply a factor of half the population is under 30. However you slice it or dice it, it's 1.5 billion people across Africa and the Middle East. MENA alone's 500 million. The unemployment rate's incredibly high, so people have little opportunity cost to starting companies. So you can take a look at it from that perspective. Funding them obviously means great growth for jobs. VC-backed companies globally generate 2.8 times as many jobs as non-VC-backed companies. So the fact that our venture system remains underfunded means that the opportunity to create jobs is not there. And part of it is simply the opportunities. So when we take a look across systems and across industries, we were very, very focused on fintech in 2018 and 19, before it was a thing. And we were fortunate enough to place a lot of investments in those opportunities across the value chain, from infrastructure to B2B to B2C. But the fact that the region was one of the most highly non-financially included at 85% unbanked, now we're closer to 60% unbanked, we just thought that you're not going to fix that by building banks. So we got ahead of it. In 2020, we focused a lot on health tech. And as we look as a firm, what we do as we try to become a lighthouse for the best founders is we do a lot of research. So before doing fintech, we wrote 85 pages on fintech in the region because nobody does research on the region in tech. Before we did digital health, it ended up being 140 pages. What does it mean? How do you map it? Who are the players? When we took a look, we have 0.2 doctors per 1,000 in Sub-Sahara, 1.1 in MENA. You're at 4 in Africa per 1,000 people. So we just figured you're not going to fix healthcare inclusion by building hospitals, just like you didn't fix financial inclusion by building banks. So how do we get ahead of that? We made about 12 investments in digital health. Some of them have gone global. So regional technologies leapfrogging, really becoming best in class, because if there's no infrastructure and legacy to overcome, then you really can build with what is the best technology in the world and what is the problem I'm trying to solve, and not have those legacy hurdles. Now we're looking at our next fund, and we're saying, what do the next 5 to 8 years look like? So our funds are always agnostic, but we say half of it's going to focus on a sector that we really believe is game-changing, both financially. So Fund 1 is a top decile fund globally, like 0.7 DPI, 2.7 TVPI, but more importantly, it's really served financial inclusion. 28 million people financially included through the companies we backed, 4.5 million have healthcare access, and you can still get those numbers. Now we stop and see what's happening in the world. We try to do the macro research and see what's on the ground. We looked at agritech a year ago, and we invested in Red Sea Farms, which is a Saudi-based company that reduces the consumption of energy by 90% to desalinate water for vertical farms. And you reduce the consumption of water by 95%. They came out of Kaust, they're Saudi-based, they're growing massively in the UAE and Saudi. They're also growing massively in Arizona and Wyoming. So you take a look at our technologies leapfrog. They take a look at there is no legacy, how do we do this? They don't build farms, they retrofit the software. So again, massively scalable companies thinking globally. And then you have the regional ones that are more focused on the region. Where we sit today, we take a look and we see the key sectors remain agritech and food security, which we'll focus on going forward. But also we take a look at the curiosity behind the flip side of supply chain disruption. What does that mean that you have a deglobalizing world? What does that mean that the UAE has always been at the forefront of logistics? And where's the opportunity there? And so things we talked about 5 years ago that were, in theory, like Star Wars. So you would talk about 3D printing and additive manufacturing, and you're like, yeah, that's cute, like nice theoretical science, are now commercial companies with tens of millions in revenue, profitable, and not serving, the cute things, but rather serving oil and gas, right? And regionally and locally. When you take a look at drone deliveries on a commercial level, that is now a reality. Again, you're not going to take 5 billion people that don't have street addresses and give them street addresses. You're going to figure out a better way to serve them, both commercially and independently. So when we take a look at leapfrogging, the flip side of supply chain disruption is really an interesting opportunity for the region, as is agritech, and we continue with digital health, especially in the mental health space, as we have a generation coming up that has suffered from COVID, as we have the highest suicide rates for teenagers in the world, and so on and so forth. And then we will always look at energy management. So as one of the highest carbon footprints in the world, we take a look and say, we're not going to try to reverse that, But we have 750 million people across Middle East and Africa that don't have access to energy. That is 80% of the world that doesn't have access to energy, lives within our framework. How do we look at that? What are the opportunities? How do you create microgrids that are actually solar-based? And how do you really leverage no infrastructure? Therefore, I'm building from scratch. So we think about it. I mean, supply chain is the one that excites me most. Last year, globally, there was $59 billion put into supply chain tech. Only $15 million was in the region of 59 billion. And this is a region that is home to so many. So we take a look at who are the companies, what are they doing, and is this really disruptive? That's what we're looking at, and that's interesting.
I mean, so you are at the forefront of this. One of the stats that's always really shocked me is that the UAE is within a 5-hour radius of 80% of the world's population. I think that Emirates Airline was the one who first kind of came out with that, but it's so shocking, right? I think this means that the UAE has a huge potential responsibility and opportunity to grow and to really create these defining investment platforms. Mohammed, I'd love to kind of hear a little bit more from you on what you think the UAE's responsibility and role is in investing in some of these innovative technologies and any government initiatives that you want to highlight today.
Well, the UAE been always a frontier in the region, and we always invest in different innovative solution and projects. If we look into different funds, if I can shed light on Hub 71 in Abu Dhabi, where it look into different opportunities, or the other funds within the UAE, we always look into the region around us. We've been a hub for the region and to attract the latest trends and latest technology and even innovative individuals throughout the systems, throughout the laws and regulation UAE introduced. And that's the let's say the uniqueness of UAE within a, if I can call it, an interesting region, as my esteemed colleague said. So that's what we got from our side.
Yeah, and Amer, Sufyan, if you have anything to add there, you know, we've seen tremendous growth already. I mean, Hub 71, when I was at Mubadala, that was a project that was very close to me as well. But if there's other opportunities that you guys want to highlight.
So let me, just to try, to give you some kind of reflection. Almost 6 months ago, our managing director visited UAE for the first time in his official capacity. And he got the opportunity to meet with, senior government officials, including His Excellency Abdullah bin Toq, and of course, most of the major executive in the UAE. Then he had an interview with the National, and the editor-in-chief asked him about his reflection after a few days of the visit to the UAE. And he said that the UAE seems to be Silicon Valley meeting with Wall Street to talk about emerging market. And if you think about it, in fact, this is the reality, where you have a country that enjoys the whole ecosystem for innovation, for entrepreneurship. And I think Noor already articulated some of the aspects that been going on in the country. And this is where we see even potential investment and where the entrepreneur would like to be for the connectivity, for the access to talent, and access also to capital. And then we see the focus on cross-border investment, basically around key development, opportunities and challenges, whether around renewables, the climate business in general, where we work very closely with UAE-based companies on this front, but also other issues like pharmaceutical and health services, and of course, the issue of food security. And the focus here is on emerging market, but also there is a global aspect of that. For me, I think Investopia is a demonstration of this, where we bring innovation to the table, And then we talk about like no finance, but also with the flavor of the global and emerging market focus.
So I'm going to broaden it a little bit, and we promise to be very brief. I mean, so my day job is to look at all emerging markets, not just the Middle East. And one of the lessons that I've come out with, and I think it has relevance to our region, is that as policymakers, get your policies right, and then let Noor decide where best to invest. The idea of us coming up with what is the best sectoral decision is not where policymakers should be spending their time, right? Instead, focus on fiscal sustainability, on transparency, institutional strength, regulatory clarity, focus on constraints, on structural constraints like demography, right? Deal with long-term issues such as security, education, health, introduce social safety nets. And once you do that, and once you assure investors that everything I mentioned is not reversible, next time there's a bust, then you set the framework or the platform correctly for the entrepreneurs to step in. And I think this is the lesson, I think, of the region, that the region has learned from 70 years worth of developments, where instead of picking winners and using the short-term cyclical upswing to pick winners and decide where, now the lesson has been, it's a different lesson that was learned. Put the framework properly, set the stage right, and let the private sector decide where it wants to invest.
And the private sector enjoys the regulatory framework, and the ADGM's done a great job in attracting a lot of that. But also, to your point earlier, the talent, the ability to attract talent to the UAE is front and foremost, because as companies scale, when they're young, anybody can do it, they're hustlers. But as they grow, they need the regulatory framework to attract international investors, which they've been doing successfully. They also need that framework to attract international talent. Absolutely. That wants to come in and wants to do well, but wants to know that they are doing it in a place that has longevity in mind.
Absolutely.
And we are at the SALT conference, and there is a huge focus on digital assets. And the fund I run is also a digital assets fund. I would be remiss if I didn't kind of focus on the focus that the UAE has on digital assets right now, and the tremendous pull that there is right now with golden visas to bring top talent from the digital asset space into the region. I'd love, with the last few minutes that we have remaining, to have the panel talk a little bit about digital assets and the region. And we'd love to hear, Mohammed, from you also on how Investopia is going to be looking at digital assets in the future, and what else is upcoming for Investopia in the future.
Well, Investopia is still new. We just launched it 6 months ago, and we got huge plans for Investopia. We launched our, as part of Investopia, our global talks, and that's why we're here today. We're looking to engage with thought leaders and investors just to discuss and hear from each other. We need to connect more. And digital assets is part of such talks. Going back to our global talks, we started in India, where we went to Morocco, Switzerland, and that's where we're here today. Yesterday, we announced our venture, or our MOU signing with SALT, where both organizations see a great synergy. And we'll be also organizing an event together in Abu Dhabi in March 23, and that's where we hope we'll see everyone there.
Great. Well, thank you. And if there's any more comments on digital assets, I know, Noor, you and I have collaborated a little bit. What are you seeing with founders today on digital assets in the region?
So, digital assets are definitely something that we're interested in and curious about, and still learning. I think that in the region specifically, people are very excited. The UAE's been at the forefront of it with the establishment of VARA and other entities to help bring some transparency and focus onto what can and cannot be done. Our perspective is really much more on the infrastructure around Web3. So what we take a look at is digital assets are very interesting, because as you try to leapfrog, and again, most of the region, the UAE is very much an anomaly and a great anomaly, but most of the region still has no Web2 infrastructure in reality. And so if you're just going to start building, why would you ever build on something that's old? You would start with Web3. And so our belief is that the region will leapfrog. I mean, we backed an entrepreneur 7 months ago, 8 months ago in Pakistan. So we invest really broad. A young female entrepreneur that was using Web3 infrastructure to build a learning platform to allow engineers to learn how to code in emerging market languages and in English. Free course, then with the marketplace so that she could place them into projects and take 30% of their 1-year income off those projects. Their Series A just got led by Sequoia. So you take a look at how you can find these regional best-in-class founders and help them grow. And a lot of it will be this leapfrogging into Web3, into blockchain, ultimately into crypto as a solution. When digital assets as a solution for many different things. We're very quickly getting there.
Thank you guys so much for that insightful conversation. Sufyan, you said it really well, that this is the Silicon Valley of the region, and we hope to continue to see all the great stuff that comes out of the region. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending.